In 1943, the British offered America the most powerful anti-tank gun of the war. American Ordnance looked at it, ran their evaluations, and said, no thanks, they preferred their own design. 2 years later, when Panthers started appearing at the Battle of the Bulge, American field commanders suddenly wanted Fireflies. They wanted the gun they'd been told wasn't good enough. This isn't a story about ballistics. It's about what happens when institutional pride writes checks that soldiers have to cash. And before we get into who said no and why, we need to address something that's been bouncing around comment sections for weeks now. Why didn't Britain just use the 25-pounder? Fair question. The Ordnance QF 25-pounder was one of the finest artillery pieces of the entire war. British gunners loved it. Reliable, versatile, capable of reaching targets nearly 7 miles away. It served across every theatre, from North Africa to Burma. So if you've already got this excellent gun in your inventory, why develop something entirely new? Here's the thing. The 25-pounder was designed to lob shells over obstacles, arc them up, bring them down on enemy positions. That's what field artillery does. Muzzle velocity? About 1,700 feet per second. Fine for indirect fire, useless for killing tanks. When you need to punch through 4 inches of hardened steel plate moving toward you at 30 miles per hour, trajectory doesn't matter. Velocity matters. You need a shell moving so fast it doesn't care about angles because it creates its own angle. Straight through. The British learned this at places like Bir Hakeim in May 1942. Free French forces there used 25-pounders in direct fire desperation against Rommel's Panzers. It worked. Barely. Against the lighter tanks of that era, the roughly 70mm penetration capability was enough to do damage. But against anything with frontal armour exceeding 60mm, the shells bounced off. The fuse wasn't optimised for armour penetration. The sighting equipment wasn't configured for direct fire engagements. Asking a 25-pounder to kill a Tiger tank would be like asking a carpenter's hammer to drive railway spikes. So in 1940, the British War Office authorised development of a purpose-built weapon. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were working on tanks with 100mm armour, thicker than anything currently in service. The British designed a gun that could penetrate 130mm at 1,000 yards. They called it the Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder. By February 1943, it entered combat during the final Tunisian campaign. And it worked. At the Battle of Medellin on March 6, 1943, 17-pounders destroyed numerous German tanks, including several of the new Tiger I heavy tanks that had just arrived in North Africa. The weapon exceeded expectations. The British knew they'd built something exceptional. Which brings us to the Americans. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. But to understand the rejection, we first have to understand something most people never learn about American armour doctrine. Because the Ordnance Department's decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened within an institutional framework that was deliberately designed, to ensure American tanks would never need to fight German tanks at all. The man responsible for this framework was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, Commander of Army Ground Forces. McNair was one of the most influential figures in shaping American military doctrine during World War II, and he believed, with the fervour of a true convert, in something called the Tank Destroyer Doctrine. The idea was elegant on paper. Tanks exist to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. They are not designed to fight other tanks. That job belongs to a specialised force of fast, heavily armed tank destroyers, the M10, M18 and M36. that would hunt enemy armor while friendly tanks performed their infantry support role. Under this doctrine, American tanks didn't need guns capable of penetrating heavy armor. They would simply avoid tank versus tank engagements. The tank destroyers would handle that. You can probably see the problem. Doctrine works until it meets reality. And the reality of armoured warfare in 1944 was that tanks encountered other tanks whether doctrine allowed it or not. German Panthers didn't check American organisational charts before engaging Shermans. They simply killed them. McNair's elegant theory assumed Americans would always choose the time and place of engagement, that tank destroyers would always be in position when armour appeared, that enemy tanks would cooperate with American battle plans. None of these assumptions survived contact with the enemy. But McNair's doctrine had a devastating secondary effect. It provided intellectual cover for the Ordnance Department's resistance to upgunning American tanks. Why invest in a bigger tank gun when tanks aren't supposed to fight tanks? Why accept British technology when the existing 75mm was perfectly adequate for infantry support? The doctrine and the institutional resistance reinforced each other, creating a system where every decision-maker had a reason to avoid the obvious conclusion. American tanks needed bigger guns, and the men making decisions had built an entire framework to avoid admitting it. The rejection of the 17-pounder wasn't a single decision by a single person in a single meeting. It was an institutional position, arrived at through layers of evaluation, testing, and rationalization by men who genuinely believed they were acting in the best interests of American soldiers. That's what makes it tragic. Good intentions, deadly outcomes. Major General Levin H. Campbell Jr. served as Chief of Ordnance from 1942 to 1946. Campbell was a logistics man, a career officer who understood that winning a global war meant producing weapons in quantities that would overwhelm the enemy. His department wasn't just designing weapons, they were manufacturing them by the millions, shipping them across 2 oceans, supplying them with ammunition that could be produced, stored and distributed without breaking the supply chain. When Campbell's subordinates looked at the 17-pounder, they saw a British weapon firing British ammunition that no American factory produced and no American depot stocked. They saw a logistics nightmare. Working under Campbell was Major General Gladion M. Barnes, who headed research and development within the Ordnance Department. Barnes was an engineer's engineer, data and testing, systematic evaluation. His department did evaluate the 17-pounder. This is documented in Ordnance Department reports from 1943 and 1944. And they found things to criticize. The recoil system was different from American designs. The breech mechanism required different training. The ammunition used propellant formulations unfamiliar to American production lines. By August 1943, Barnes and his team had committed to a different path. The 76mm M1 gun, an American design firing American ammunition, fitted into a modified turret designated the T-23. This was their answer to German armour. They believed in it. Now, and this is important, we need to present the American case fairly before we demolish it. Because the Ordnance Department's rationale wasn't insane. It wasn't obviously stupid. On paper, their concerns were legitimate. Standardization. The US military was fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans. Every weapon fielded had to be supplied from American industrial capacity through American logistics chains. The 76mm M1 used ammunition components compatible with existing US manufacturing. The 17-pounder did not. The 76mm fit into turrets designed by American engineers for American tanks. The 17-pounder required extensive modification. From a bureaucratic perspective, these were real problems. From the perspective of a tanker staring down a Tiger's 88mm gun, they were excuses. What the official documentation doesn't state explicitly, but what historians have inferred from the pattern of decisions, is something called "not invented here" syndrome. When British representatives offered 17-pounder technology to American counterparts in 1943, they were offering a solution that implied American solutions were inadequate. For an organization that took pride in having industrialized warfare to an unprecedented degree, accepting a foreign gun meant admitting their own work had failed. The Ordnance Department's 76mm gun had been in development since 1942. Abandoning it for a British alternative would mean admitting that 2 years of American engineering had produced an inferior product. The institutional incentives all pointed one direction: believe the 76mm would be good enough. In April 1944, a pivotal evaluation compared the 17-pounder directly against the emerging American 90mm M3 gun, which was being developed for the T-26, the future M26 Pershing heavy tank. The Ordnance Department's assessment concluded that the 17-pounder was generally inferior to the 90mm gun. How convenient. That finding justified continued American development while dismissing the British option entirely. What the evaluation failed to account for was timing. The 17-pounder was available now, already in mass production, already proven in combat. The 90mm armed Pershing wouldn't see meaningful combat until March 1945, the final months of the war. For American tankers facing Panthers in Normandy, in the Ardennes, we're developing something better offered exactly zero comfort. While American ordnance was explaining why they didn't need the 17-pounder, British engineers were solving a problem everyone said couldn't be solved. The Sherman Firefly shouldn't have been possible. The 17-pounder was never meant to fit inside a Sherman turret. The barrel extended over 10 feet from breech to muzzle. The recoil force was tremendous. The ammunition was significantly larger than the 75mm rounds the Sherman was designed to carry. On paper, it couldn't be done. Engineers at the Department of Tank Design, working with Vickers Armstrong, found a way. The key breakthrough involved mounting the gun rotated 90 degrees from its normal orientation, lying on its side, essentially, which allowed the recoil mechanism to fit within the turret's restricted space. A new recoil system had to be designed. The turret bustle was extended with an armored box for the radio, which had to be moved to make room for the breech. The hull machine gunner's position was eliminated entirely to create space for additional ammunition. The conversion wasn't elegant. Firefly crews operated in more cramped conditions than standard Sherman crews. The loader's job became significantly harder with larger, heavier ammunition. But by spring 1944, Fireflies were rolling off conversion lines. British armoured doctrine called for 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks, the single long-barreled killer that would engage enemy heavy armour while the 75mm Shermans provided support. The Commonwealth's contribution to tank warfare extended beyond Britain. Australia developed the AC Sentinel, the first tank designed and built on Australian soil, a remarkable engineering achievement for a nation with no prior tank-building experience. The Sentinel program demonstrated that Commonwealth nations could innovate independently when circumstances demanded. But the Firefly conversion itself was British engineering, conducted at British facilities, solving a problem British tankers would face. The story of Australian armour deserves its own telling. This one belongs to the engineers who made a gun fit where it shouldn't. Canadian forces operated Sherman Fireflies extensively throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. These units deserve to be identified by name. The 1st Hussars, that's the 6th Armoured Regiment, fought through Normandy and into the Scheldt campaign with Fireflies as part of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. The Canadian Grenadier Guards, serving as the 22nd Armoured Regiment within the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, operated Fireflies during Operations Totalize and Tractable in August 1944. The 28th Armoured Regiment, the British Columbia Regiment, and the 21st Armoured Regiment, the Governor-General's Foot Guards, similarly deployed Fireflies as their heavy-hitting element against German armour. Operation Totalize began on August 8, 1944. Canadian armour advanced through the night using artificial moonlight. Searchlights bounced off clouds, an innovation called Monty's Moonlight. When dawn brought German counterattacks by Panthers and Panzer IVs, Canadian Firefly crews found themselves in exactly the kind of engagement the 17-pounder was designed for. The long gun could engage German armour at ranges where the standard 75mm Sherman was nearly useless. Operation Tractable followed on August 14th, pushing Canadian forces toward the Falaise pocket. The fighting was close, savage. Tank casualties ran high on both sides, but Canadian Firefly crews consistently demonstrated that the 17-pounder could do what the 75mm could not: penetrate frontal armour on Panthers at combat ranges. Canadian tankers who served in these operations left accounts describing both the advantages and the burden. The Germans learned quickly to identify Fireflies by their distinctive long barrels. That made Fireflies priority targets. A Firefly crew knew they'd draw extra fire, knew German gunners would try to kill them first. Their survival depended on getting the first shot off before the enemy could range them. It was an honour and a death sentence in equal measure. Canadian crews accepted it because they knew their troopmates in the 75mm Shermans depended on that big gun. For those who want numbers before rendering judgment, here's the comparison American ordnance should have made in 1943. The 17-pounder fired armour-piercing rounds at 2,900 feet per second. At 500 metres, it could penetrate 140 millimetres of rolled homogeneous armour angled at 30 degrees. At 1,000 metres, penetration dropped to 130 millimetres. With the later APDS rounds, armour-piercing discarding sabot, penetration exceeded 200 millimetres at 500 metres. A Tiger I had 102 millimetres of frontal armour. A Panther had 80 millimetres angled at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of roughly 140 millimetres. The 17-pounder could kill both at typical combat ranges. Not theory, demonstrated repeatedly from Normandy to the Rhine. The American 76mm M1, the gun the Ordnance Department championed as their answer to German armour, fired at 2,600 feet per second, nearly 300 feet per second slower. At 500 metres, penetration was 100 to 110 millimetres. At 1,000 metres, roughly 90 millimetres. Against a Tiger I frontally? Marginal at best. Against a Panther's glacis? The angle and thickness combined to make frontal penetration essentially impossible at combat ranges. American 76mm Sherman crews learned to aim for side shots, or hope the Germans exposed their flanks. British and Canadian Firefly crews? They aimed centre mass. The German 88mm KWK-36 on the Tiger I fired at 2,657 feet per second, with penetration of about 120 millimetres at 500 metres. German gunners could penetrate any Sherman from any angle at any typical engagement range. The only question was whether they acquired targets before the Fireflies could respond. What about the 90mm M3, The gun American Ordnance claimed was superior. Muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Penetration at 500 meters of roughly 122 millimeters. Competitive with the 17-pounder. Not superior, as claimed, but comparable. The critical difference was availability. The 90mm required an entirely new tank platform. The M26 Pershing didn't enter combat in meaningful numbers until March 1945. The war in Europe ended in May. The 17-pounder was available in 1943. The 90mm was a promise. The 17-pounder was reality. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Sherman Fireflies went ashore with British and Canadian tank units, their long barrels easily distinguishable from the standard 75mm Shermans around them. American tank units landed with 75mm armed Shermans almost exclusively. The 76mm versions were available, but had been held back from initial deployments due to concerns about ammunition supply and training. Within days, American tankers discovered what British and Canadian crews already knew. June 13, 1944, Villers-Bocage. A single Tiger I, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, ambushed a British column of the 7th Armoured Division. In minutes, Wittmann destroyed numerous tanks and vehicles. The 75mm guns of the standard Shermans could barely scratch his Tiger's armour. Accounts differ on how Wittmann's rampage finally ended. Some historians credit Firefly gunner Joe Eakins with killing Wittmann weeks later during a subsequent engagement on August 8, 1944, a claim that remains actively disputed to this day, with alternative theories crediting other units and other weapons. What's not disputed is the lesson of Villers-Bocage itself. Without adequate anti-tank capability, Allied tank crews were prey. And then came the moment when everything changed. July 12, 1944, a field near Isigny, France. The most important gunnery demonstration of the war, and almost nobody knows it happened. General Omar Bradley was there. So were senior officers from 1st Army Headquarters, representatives from Ordnance, and technical observers who would write reports that would land on desks in Washington within days. The purpose? Test American tank guns against captured German armour. Real Panthers, real combat conditions, real answers to the question that had been building since D-Day. The demonstration was methodical, clinical. They positioned a captured Panther at measured ranges and began firing. First, the 75mm gun. Standard Sherman armament. The round struck the Panther's glacis plate with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. It didn't penetrate. It didn't even come close. The shell shattered against that angled armor like it was designed to. No surprise there. Everyone knew the 75mm was inadequate. That's why they developed the 76mm. Then they brought up a 76mm armed Sherman. The gun that American Ordnance had championed, the weapon they'd chosen over the 17-pounder, the solution to German heavy armour. The gunner acquired the target, fired. The round hit the Panther's frontal armour and... nothing. It bounced, or shattered, or simply failed to do what everyone in that field had been told it could do. They fired again. Same result. And again. General Bradley watched his anti-tank doctrine disintegrate in real time. The gun that was supposed to be good enough wasn't. Every calculation, every assurance, every bureaucratic decision that had led to this moment was wrong. The 76mm could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at typical combat ranges. The silence that followed must have been extraordinary. What this meant was immediately viscerally clear to every officer present. Every Sherman in the European theatre, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of crewmen, was effectively defenceless against frontal attack by the tank the Germans were fielding in increasing numbers. McNair's tank destroyer doctrine assumed specialists would handle armour threats. But tank destroyers weren't always there, and when Shermans met Panthers without support, American crews died. The correspondence that followed the Isigny tests carried a tone that doesn't appear often in military bureaucracy: panic. Urgent requests went up the chain demanding bigger guns, better ammunition, anything that could actually kill German armour. Officers who had nodded along to ordnance briefings about standardization and logistics suddenly wanted to know why American tankers were dying in undergunned vehicles. The comfortable distance between Washington planning sessions and French battlefields collapsed in a single afternoon. Bradley himself was reportedly furious. He'd trusted the assurances. He'd deployed his men based on what he'd been told. And now he'd watched those assurances bounce off German steel. By August 1944, American tank units were reporting consistent difficulty engaging German armour. Field reports documented the problem in language that should have burned through every layer of bureaucracy. The 75mm gun was inadequate. The 76mm was marginally better, but still struggled against frontal armour. American tankers were dying in burning Shermans because the guns they'd been given couldn't penetrate the tanks trying to kill them. The Germans knew the Sherman's reputation. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. The grim joke circulated among both German and American troops. American crews knew the reputation too. They just couldn't do anything about it. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair never saw the full consequences of his doctrine. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, he was killed by friendly fire when American bombers dropped their payloads short. He died believing his tank destroyer doctrine was sound. He died before the Ardennes proved otherwise. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge. German forces launched their final major offensive on the Western Front with over 400,000 troops, including concentrated armour that American intelligence had failed to detect. Panthers, Tigers, tank destroyers. The Wehrmacht threw everything into one last gamble to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. American forces in the Ardennes were caught unprepared. Many units were resting, refitting, recovering from months of continuous combat. When German armour came through the forest, American tank crews found themselves in exactly the situation McNair's doctrine said would never happen. Tanks fighting tanks, with no tank destroyers in position, no time to manoeuvre, no choice but to engage or die. The 76mm armed Shermans that had finally reached the front in meaningful numbers could engage some German tanks under favourable conditions. But favourable conditions meant side shots at close range. It meant hoping the German crew was inexperienced. It meant luck. Against a Panther, frontally at 800 metres, the 76mm was a noisemaker. Against a Tiger, it was a death sentence. American field commanders, watching their tankers die in inadequate vehicles, began formally requesting Fireflies. The same gun American Ordnance had evaluated and rejected, the same weapon they deemed inferior. The same technology they declined because it didn't fit their ammunition supply chain, their turret designs, their institutional pride. They wanted it now, desperately, urgently. The men in the field had seen what the men in Washington refused to see. The requests went up the chain. They were documented. They exist in archives. American commanders asking for British guns to save American lives because American guns couldn't do the job. The irony writes itself. The M26 Pershing finally arrived, but not as salvation, as proof. Operation Zebra brought the first 20 M26 Pershings to the European theatre in late January 1945. 20 tanks. After months of tankers dying in undergunned Shermans, after the Ardennes, after Isigny, after all of it, 20 tanks. Enough to form a single heavy tank platoon for evaluation purposes. The solution that Ordnance had promised was almost ready, dribbled into the theatre, while American crews continued fighting in vehicles everyone now knew were inadequate. The Pershings went to the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions for combat testing. Their crews were eager. Finally, a gun that could fight back. February 26, 1945, Elsdorf, Germany. A Pershing from the 3rd Armoured Division encountered a Tiger I in the rubble-strewn streets. This was the moment American tankers had been waiting for. A fair fight, gun to gun, American versus German heavy metal. The Pershing fired first. The 90mm round struck the Tiger's frontal armour and penetrated. The Tiger burned. After years of bouncing shells and desperate manoeuvring for side shots, an American tank had killed a Tiger from the front. The 90mm did exactly what Ordnance had promised it would do. But here's the thing that makes this victory taste like ashes. It was February 1945. The gun worked. The gun had always been capable of working. The failure wasn't engineering, it was timing. While Barnes and Campbell and the Ordnance Department had been comparing the 90mm favourably to the 17-pounder, while they'd been writing evaluations and conducting tests and defending their decisions, American tankers had been dying in vehicles that couldn't fight back. March 6, 1945, Cologne. The most famous tank duel of the war, though few people know it happened. A Pershing from the 3rd Armoured Division engaged a Panther near the Cologne Cathedral. The engagement was filmed by combat cameraman Jim Bates, making it one of the only tank versus tank fights from World War II captured on motion picture. The Panther fired first, missed. The Pershing fired, hit. The Panther began to burn. The German crew tried to bail out. Some made it, some didn't. And watching the footage, you can see exactly what American tankers had been missing since June 1944. A gun that worked. A tank that could stand and fight. A vehicle that gave its crew a chance. The Pershing proved the 90mm was a capable weapon, but it also proved the Ordnance Department's argument had always been a lie of omission. The question was never whether American engineering could produce a gun to match the 17-pounder. The question was when. And the answer, March 1945, meant that the gun arrived just in time to be irrelevant. The war in Europe ended in May. For the tankers who'd spent 1944 in 75mm and 76mm Shermans, watching their rounds bounce off German armour, the Pershing was vindication for a corpse. Tanker memoirs from the period describe the specific terror of engaging German heavy armour. You'd fire. You'd watch your round hit. You'd watch it bounce or shatter. And in the seconds it took to reload, you'd know the German gunner was traversing toward you, and his round wouldn't bounce. Some crews learned tricks. They'd aim for tracks, trying to immobilize rather than destroy. They'd maneuver for side shots, accepting longer exposure time in exchange for a chance at penetration. They'd coordinate with multiple tanks, hoping to overwhelm a single German vehicle through volume of fire. None of these were solutions. They were survival mechanisms developed by men whose equipment had failed them. What's the verdict then? Was American ordnance guilty of arrogance, of institutional pride that cost lives? You've seen the evidence. The tank destroyer doctrine that assumed tanks would never fight tanks. The documented rejections of the 17-pounder. The evaluations that found it generally inferior to a gun that wouldn't see combat for another year. The logistics arguments that made perfect sense in a Pentagon briefing room and no sense at all in a burning tank. The Isigny tests, where 76mm rounds shattered against Panther armour while Bradley watched. The field reports from commanders who couldn't penetrate enemy armour. The desperate requests for the weapon that had been dismissed 2 years earlier. The defence will tell you that standardization matters, that you can't fight a global war without consistent supply chains, that American ordnance made reasonable decisions based on the information available, that McNair's doctrine was sound in principle, if not in practice. The prosecution will point to the gap between the 17-pounder's 140mm penetration and the 76mm's 100mm penetration. Will point to Villers-Bocage, to Isigny, to the Ardennes, to every Sherman that burned because its gun couldn't kill the tank killing it. Reasonable decisions. Dead tankers. There's a question that belongs here. It comes from a tanker. Could be American, could be British, could be Canadian, doesn't matter. Who served in a Sherman during those months when German heavy armour owned the battlefield. What did he remember most about tank combat in World War II? The feeling of firing at a Panther, watching the round hit, watching it bounce off, and knowing there wasn't going to be time for a second shot. The 17-pounder could have changed that. It was offered. It was refused. And when the men who'd refused it finally understood what they'd done, the men who'd paid the price were already in the ground. Subscribe for more stories like this.